right? Where if you are in a situation in which you're high-fiving, protesters who are there specifically counter protesting an event.
But on either side,
but it's different. As a counter protester, you are high-fiving one of the counter protesters who's advocating for all sorts of things about that particular group. The perception.
All right, guys, welcome back to the channel. For today's video, we're actually going to be talking about a very broad range of topics today. But I think that it all kind of boils down to the qualifications that a person must have if they're going to be on a civilian review board. I believe that if you're going to be a civilian member of a review board who tells police how to do their job, there's a couple of fundamental understandings that you must have. You must have a fundamental understanding of the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights. Specifically today, we're going to be talking about the First Amendment. Then you also must understand a police officer's role in supporting the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and protecting people's ability to take advantage of those rights. And then we're going to get into a discussion on what the government's role is when it comes to the First Amendment and whether or not people should be allowed to say things that we don't like. And I think that this is something that's been covered at great depths, but it rears its ugly head once again today. The reason that we're having this discussion is because I need to kind of set the stage for you here. Back in December of 2022, there was a drag queen story hour event. We've seen how these things go, and a bunch of people show up to support the event. And there's a bunch of people that protest speaking out against the event. These groups are like the United Front, the Proud Boys, and stuff like that. That is exactly what happened on this particular day. And there was an incident where a Columbus police officer, who's actually a sergeant, was directing traffic. And a group of Proud Boys walked by him and they said, "You're doing a great job directing traffic." And he said, "You know what? Thank you." And he put his hand up, gave him a high five. This created a stir, a ruckus in the city of Columbus. I actually have a little video from a news story right here that I'd like to play for you.
Yes. The video shows a Sergeant Dyer with Columbus Police being confronted by a woman asking why he high-fived a member of the Proud Boys, a designated hate group.
I'm here hanging out with them. I'm not here to support their cause. I'm here to support their right to protest.
Sergeant Dyer tells the woman he understands how it looks, but says he was simply building relationships while protecting everyone's right to protest.
The thing is you just don't high-five a white nationalist.
All right, so due to the ruckus that was caused on that, there was an investigation into this guy right here. The sergeant that was seen on video high-fiving a Proud Boy as he crossed the street. And that investigation exonerated the officer. Said, you know what? The officer was doing what we expect the officer to do. He never said that he supported anyone's cause. He was supporting everybody equally, yada, yada, yada. And I think he even mentioned somewhere in the investigation or during the interview, he's like, yeah, I realized that some people were probably mad that I high-fived that guy, but I wanted him to feel that he was supported. And I felt that by him feeling he wasn't supported, he was less likely to become violent. So I chose to do that. Well, the Columbus Police Civilian Review Board, at least a couple of members of the review board, took issue with that. And they basically said, and this is what Kyle Strickland says that as a police officer, you must understand that there's a difference between a protester and a counter protester. And you need to understand the optics of that situation when you're making these decisions. So him and the rest of the Civilian Review Board went on to argue for about 15 minutes about this topic. And it blows my mind because Kyle Strickland is an attorney. He apparently he went to law school, and he should have studied the Constitution at some point when he went to law school. And he should understand that the role of a police officer is not to choose sides and not to decide who the good protesters and who the bad protesters are, but that's what he expects them to do. He also wants officers to go out there and keep the peace, but he wants them to do it exactly the way he would do it. My advice to you or people like Kyle Strickland, that if you think you can do a better job of keeping the peace than the police officers, maybe you should go out there and do it yourself. Until then, you need to shut up and stay on the sidelines. I'm going to play the video in just a couple seconds, but you'll see that he's going to demonstrate time and time again during this debate that he does not understand the First Amendment of the Constitution, doesn't understand the rights that are afforded to our citizens, and doesn't understand a police officer's role in keeping the peace. The police officers went out and did an excellent job. They kept the peace. Everybody felt comfortable. It went off without a hitch. But he thinks that police officers, rather than enforcing the law and protecting people's rights, should be more concerned about the optics of the situation. What he wants the police to do is become political activists. We cannot have police departments that are working as political activists. People that hold that viewpoint they should not be on boards that are telling police officers how to do their job. I think that's going to be my take on it. I'll let you see the rest of the debate for yourselves. Let me know in the comments what you think. I'll talk to you later.
I have a question in terms of what is going to happen moving forward. I know there was indication that the chief indicated that they would use this particular incident as a training, moving forward. My question is, what exactly does that mean? Because the optics, to me, it's pretty bad optics, and the notion that was done in a way to de-escalate. To me, I don't necessarily know if that even aligns with best practices. And so I'm a little concerned that, we're going to just kind of go ahead and move along with this one without any other set of recommendation moving forward here, because if it's not a violation of policy, then what's to stop this from happening again? And I think, I know personally the optics don't look great. And then also, I think the uproar that after this happened indicates that others feel that way as well. And so I just am a little concerned that if this is kind of within policy and that this is going to be the policy moving forward, that we're going to run into a situation like this again. Not to mention that we've just had some incidents this past weekend in terms of with protesters coming down here. So is there any steps that,
well, this was a team that was sent to Europe for training. It appears that, I don't know if there was anything about high-fiving, but that they were operating according to best practices in general. So the officer who was charged with high-fiving can be heard on his body-worn camera to be saying that they're not there to collect information, to build cases, to make arrests. They're there to protect First Amendment rights, and that it's important to build rapport. They repeatedly said to reporters as well as others that they would not share any personal opinions about the situation. They're government employees. They're there to do a professional job, and on and on. So I'm not sure what else, other than not having contact with anyone, additional training would advance this. This is a specially trained unit that we've sent to Europe to get best practices. So
I think it's a good idea to keep in mind that you can protect First Amendment rights without interacting with the individuals who are protesting. The Skokie case, for instance, those individuals who were protesting didn't have to interact with the individuals who were protesting there. You have to be, especially if you receive this much training, you're a sergeant, you need to be aware of what you're doing, and maybe just a little bit more awareness. Sure, they followed policy, but we all make, in the heat of the moment, we all do things. But being in that position, especially with an organization like the Proud Boys and what was going on, you just have to be very aware of your actions, I think.
All right, but I had friends that were there on the other side, and commented how great the police were. You know, that how great the interaction was, and I think there was involvement with both groups, actually a lot. I think that one unfortunate circumstance is what got brought to light, but I think there was interaction with both groups quite a bit, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think the training aspect, I think that element of it certainly makes sense. I do think a review of policy here, you know, because I'm not necessarily comfortable with the idea that if this happens again, and we're just like, well, it's within policy that, you know, you high five. I don't think that is necessarily the optics we're going for moving forward. And so, you know, I would hope that if we move forward on this, that we actually do make an amendment in terms of including with additional review of policy and training. Obviously, I know this has been mentioned, but I would like that to be attached to this specific case because of what it has led to more broadly, and the fact that this could happen again.
So I think in terms of keeping the two separate, we vote on the IG's finding and then discuss how to move forward with CPD in terms of making that recommendation. And if you have, you know, what that proposed recommendation would be. But I think we also need to address the context of that. The guy was making a comment on the officer about directing traffic, high five and stuff. So, you know, how do we integrate like them to be, you know, for training? Like, how do you train in terms of the response to that? So that's something we should think about. But I think we should keep the two separate. So if we could vote on the IG's findings, and then we can further discuss what this proposed recommendation for policy should be.
I mean, is there a particular reason to keep them separate? I'm just trying to.
Well, we're accepting the IG's findings, and then we're saying, you know, that there was no violation.
Yeah, I mean,
and I think if I could, Board Member Strickland, so by attaching, and this is just my thinking out loud, by attaching it specifically to this sergeant's behavior, I think we're saying we want this sergeant to be retrained. I think by making a separate motion and saying we would like there to be either a review of how this particular training is integrated with cultural competence and cultural awareness, I think that can be a broader applied to the whole police force, not necessarily this one
incident.
Officer.
So I'm speaking to the specific policy itself, right? And then the training, which the police chief indicated herself that this would be used as a tool. I don't think about that individual officer. I thought it was related to the CPD dialogue team generally. So that's kind of what I'm referencing. But if we need to separate, I'm not sure.
Ms. Ross and I have talked about this previously and have both have directed the board prior that they should be separate because you're making a separate decision on the IG's recommendations, but then feel that there might be some tangential issue that you want to make a motion on. I've been looking through the code in terms of, you know, duties and responsibilities, and so you know, I think that there's a subsection here to make recommendations to the police regarding policies and procedures. So yes, they should be separate. The second thing that I would say, and again, I don't want to kind of go too far afield in terms of what my role is as legal counsel, but you definitely want to make sure that you're kind of staying in your lane in terms of duties and responsibilities as a board, in terms of finding whether there's been excessive use of force or a violation of policy. You don't want to, yes, you have some authority to make recommendations regarding policies, procedures, training, but you want to be careful not to stray into the minutia of kind of how all of that plays out in the field. You know, officers are acting in real time, making thousands of decisions very quickly over the course of hours at any part, and everything is case specific and dependent on the specific facts and circumstances of a particular situation. And there has to be some leeway, if you will, for them to be able to work within a policy. And yes, optics are important, but optics are not policy, right? So, there was a finding here that they acted within policy. Yes, some of the optics associated with acting within that policy may not have been preferred, and that be maybe something that the chief can work with the officers about, but it may not result, like, even if you make the recommendation, they may not change the policy. They may just kind of use this as a learning tool for this particular set of facts and circumstances. So you just want to be careful in terms of how far you stray.
And just generally with regard to like an officer's, an investigative finding for a particular officer, if you're going to exonerate the officer and say that he hasn't done anything wrong, asking for remedial training would be a disciplinary action in the event he did something wrong. So that is why you want to keep that kind of separate. So right now, if we're saying, hey, while we maybe don't agree with the policy or don't agree with the optics, he's not going to be disciplined for having done anything outside of policy. And then separate and apart from that, we may make a statement or send something to CPD with a recommendation with regard to training more broadly or policy more broadly.
Right.
So you don't want to muddy up the investigative finding because that's going to go through an entire process. And we want to make sure your investigative finding doesn't get thrown out or recommendation for discipline doesn't get thrown out because you've muddied up kind of.
How would so I agree with not muddying up, but how would the recommendation get thrown out if it's a discretionary, if the recommendation itself is discretionary?
What I'm saying is just like common sense. If you're going to say, hey, we recommend that the IG's finding of exonerated be accepted and sent on. So he didn't do anything wrong, but we can't then say, well, we want remedial training to happen because we're saying he didn't do anything wrong.
Well, I mean,
for that particular officer.
I guess the specifics, we can do it separate, but the specifics for the training, at least what I'm suggesting is for the CPD dialogue team.
Yeah, and just do that separately and apart. So you want to vote on the motion for the investigative finding, be done with that, send that up its separate chain, and then have your discussion afterwards with regard to the more broader issues.
Okay, we've got first and seconds already on the table. Barring any further discussion, before we move on to the separate question, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, motion carries. All right, next up, so to talk about what to do or what recommendation to make, do you have language for a motion, Board Member Strickland, that you'd like to put forward on training the dialogue team?
Yeah, and happy to get this cleaned up for it to necessarily to be. I'd like to make a motion as it relates to this specific policy that we just discussed for additional training and review of the policy itself relating to how the CPD dialogue team operates, in these types of situations.
I'll second that.
Yeah, discussion?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm concerned about getting into fact patterns that if we reverse the situation and the CPD officer was high-fiving with one of the dancers or folks on the other side, would we have difficulty with that if the exact same situation, that is that they were being complimented for handling the situation well and directing traffic well, and one of the folks on the other side put out their hand to high five and they just stuck their hands in their pockets or didn't in any way acknowledge the relationship. We're getting down into human judgments that, really specific kinds of recommendations. I like the enforced neutrality. I like the notion that regarding First Amendment cases that we're supportive of protest on whatever side that the officer finds themselves. And this seems to me to be exactly what we would want. That is not the optics. I hear, depending on where we sit, the optics are going to land differently, but the idea that the officers are involved in de-escalating fraught situations. So when I read through the record, de-escalation was and if I reverse the players, and I say, now the officer is seen high-fiving protesters on the other side, would that be problematic for you?
So no, I mean, I think the de-escalation point is really where this is centered on, right? Where if you are in a situation in which you're high-fiving, protesters who are there specifically counter-protesting an event.
But on either side, would you have a...
but it's different as a counter-protester. You are high-fiving one of the counter-protesters who's advocating for all sorts of things about that particular group. The perception that actually doesn't de-escalate, that actually can further raise tensions, versus in another situation, again, hypothetically speaking, where somebody is seen to be high-fiving somebody, I don't see how that escalates the situation.
Well, if they were counter-protesting, I guess what I'm asking, just to clarify our thinking, let's say it was a Proud Boys event, and there were counter-protesters to that who were upset with that group and what all they stand for, and so there were counter-protesters. The police came, trained to de-escalate. They were complimented for handling the situation well by the counter-protesters, and one of the counter-protesters put up their hand to high-five. Would we want the police officer to decline and say, no, we don't want to, we're not going to touch you?
If I could, Board Member Fluharty had his hand up, so I'd like to recognize him.
We're taking away from, the great job that happened over one incident. I had, like I said earlier, I had friends that were there. Actually, they were the first people there at the protest who said it was handled wonderfully. And yes, it's unfortunate that did happen, but we're detracting away from the fact that there was a incident in which Columbus PD done a great job.
And the point I'll also just add is that I think, there is no, I don't think you can equate, right? And I'm not saying you're equating these situations, but in terms of whether the situation was different, while folks have their constitutional right to speech, you also have groups in this particular instance that has indicated a history of intimidation, threat and harm, and so the optics in this case are very different than if it were turned around, which is why, again, I'm not going to comment on specifically how, again, outside of our scope, how exactly CPD should be operating in their practices when it comes to the dialogue team. However, I do think a further review of what other best practices look like with the context of integrating these different trainings with a culture of competency is key and critical. So I would love to have that as part of that motion amendment to include that aspect that you just mentioned, Dr. Jones.